That's not the first time this happens. Believe me. There would be fake rain outside tonight, all wet with this fake water, and there was even fake lightning outside, which, to be honest, was pretty cool. I didn't know we had that in our budget. Anyways, hey everyone, I'm back with my sort of hiatus with game reviews. It's been a little while since I've done one, and there's a lot of reasons for that, but I made a little channel update video just so I wouldn't have to explain myself here, which you can watch here in a little card somewhere. Anyways, I'm glad I'm back doing these things. Anyways, tonight we're going to be looking at a request from the comments of my very first game review that I have in this channel. It was left by one of my dear friends called Nostalginator Jeffrey, or as he's known online, just Nostalginator. Nostal asks, is a longtime viewer of your channel, will you make many views of Dead Space? Wait, will you make many views of Dead Space review? If you could please do that, thanks. Grammar's a little off, and I think you meant to put as instead of is there, but nevertheless, the question is still valid. What do I think of Dead Space? Now, I know Nostal doesn't really like the game. In fact, in one of the very early episodes of Game Etc., I think we the topic was one of the worst games we ever played. He put Dead Space on there, which is kind of funny. But I personally haven't played this game in about 5 years, so I'm very rusty with this game. So with this review, hopefully you could get a much more clearer opinion about this game. So let's get into this. Let's review Dead Space for the PS3. First off, let's look at the development of the game. The game was published by EA and developed by one of their subdivisions, Redwood Shores, which they were later changed to Visceral Games. This company was known for making the Godfather games, Dante's Infernos, Battlefield Hardline, the Dead Space series of course, and a bunch of other games. Also, side note, Visceral Games just went out of business while writing this episode. Damn. Anyways, looking at the development of the game started development around 2006 when it was originally slated to be a sequel to the System Shock series out of all things, but after looking at what was popular in survival horror at the time, Resident Evil, they decided to go into a different direction with an original IP. The game was announced a year later and then was released on October 13th, 2008, just in time for the Halloween season. For this review, I'll be looking at the PS3 version of the game, because even though this game is about 10 years old, I'm pretty sure my computer will crap out while I try to play this game and record it at the same time, so I'm not gonna risk it, so that's why I'm playing this version. Anyway, now let's get into the spooky story. Ooh. Yeah, no, that's kind of cringy. Anyway, in case you want to skip out on the story or you don't want to get spoiled, skip to this time slot here. Hey, have you ever seen the movie Alien? Yes? Well, that's pretty much the plot of Dead Space. Okay, I'm bluffing a little bit, but there are some elements from the Alien film franchise that the game uses, so I figured I might as well address them now. Anyway, the game is set in space! In year 2508, the USG Ishimura, that's Stone Village in Japanese, a planet-cracking starship that mines materials from other planets, leaves out a distress signal picked up by the CEC, basically the space government, and they send off a crew to see what's going on the ship. They send a maintenance crew consisting of Commander Zach Hammond, computer specialist Kendra Daniels, the ship's engineer Isaac Clarke, who you play as, and a few nameless guys who die off in the first 5 minutes of the game. Anyways, although Isaac doesn't really have a personality, he has a sort of motive with his wife, girlfriend? I mean, the game doesn't really explain that well. But there's Nicole, where I'm guessing she's a scientist on the ship, and there's a video of her at the beginning of the game. And she just so happens to be on the Ishimura. Anyways, they make it to the ship to see what's wrong, and then they immediately get attacked by these creatures made of dead human tissues called necromorphs. And after fighting a few of them, Isaac and his crew try to leave, but oh no, their ship blows up. Now they have to try to get the hell out of there. How predictable. After that, well, the story kinda takes a back seat while the player goes from chapter to chapter going to different parts of the ship, and they basically do fetch quests. Each area at the very least is interesting, and in each chapter we get to see the ship go through more and more damage. There are a few standout moments with the story in the later chapters of the game, like where Hammond dies from one of the bosses, where Isaac basically encounters Nicole, where she basically helps him open the door and then immediately runs off. Odd that she didn't stay. Then there's this one scientist who basically goes insane and spreads the necromorphs all across the ship, and eventually becomes one. Then in a later chapter, Isaac sends off an escape pod to another military ship as a sort of beacon. But unfortunately, it was full of necromorphs, and the ship crashes into the Ishimura. Wait, if a military engineer can hold off a bunch of necromorphs with only a couple of guns, why can't a military squad do that too? Whatever, it's video game logic, I suppose. After running into and helping a scientist named Dr. Kane, Kane basically says that a quote-unquote hive mind started after the miners retrieved a sort of marker off the planet they were on, AGS-7, and everyone pretty much went insane and tried to kill each other. The miners, or the people who worked on the ship, wanted the marker to begin with because Crazy Doctor over here wanted it because it was supposedly an old relic of his religion. But not only is this thing causing everyone to go insane, cause hallucinations, and cause violent outbursts, but it also happened to have a sort of alien disease that just so happens to make dead tissue come back to life. That's the reason why everyone is fucked in the ship right now. So Dr. Kane helps Isaac and Kendra try to get the marker off the ship, and after successfully docking the marker onto an escape pod, Kane is killed by Kendra, out of all people, saying that the marker was a man-made military experiment to see what would happen, and possibly they could use it as a weapon, similar to the xenomorphs from Alien. Anyways, Isaac is betrayed and left behind in the Ishimura to die when suddenly we get a message from Nicole who helps you get onto another escape pod, and they send Isaac onto AGS-7, where he put the marker back to where it was. It turns out Nicole was just a hallucination made by the marker itself, and Nicole was dead the entire time, which in retrospect was pretty fucking obvious when Nicole kept saying, "We will be one," implying the final boss, and I'm guessing the marker. Anyways, Kendra tracks you down and tries to take the marker back, but we don't see what happens to it. Nevertheless, Isaac tries to escape the planet when the final boss monster thingy kills Kendra and traps Isaac. And then after killing it, you run off into the ship, take off your mask, and then jump scare out of all things. And that's about it. Huh. Well, overall, Dead Space story isn't breaking any boundaries in terms of storytelling. In fact, some instances it can be somewhat obvious where the story is going, but for the most part it gets the job done. The one major problem I have with the story is that the main character, or the character you play as, Isaac, is pretty much a blank slate. He barely reacts to what's going on in the game, aside from getting attacked and killed. The only time where I could find Isaac where he actually reacts to what's going on to the story is when he basically facepalms when he figures out that Nicole was dead the whole time. This was obviously implemented to make the player feel more like the character, but with a game with a metric crap ton of text and audio logs that basically fills the lore of Dead Space, I would have liked to know more about Isaac's personality, just to have a little bit more effort into that. Now, as for the gameplay, well, it's a standard third-person shooter, mimicking the controls of Resident Evil 4, which makes a lot of sense since Resident Evil 4 was kinda the norm for survival horror games at the time. But for the game's sake, we're not fighting zombies, but necromorphs, with larger limbs and sometimes even tentacles. No, nothing like that. More like this. In the game, it basically hints to you that you should shoot the necromorphs in the limbs for maximum damage, which is kind of original for the most part when games usually push for headshots for the fastest way to kill something, and it works for the most part. And depending on the game's difficulty, ammo for weapons can get pretty slim if you don't know what you're doing. Speaking of weapons, there's 6 of them that you could buy in the store, but you can only carry 4 of them. Aside from a starting pistol, in this playthrough I got a bazooka, a flamethrower, and my favorite weapon in the entire game, the Ripper. A gun where you can shoot saw blades and literally cut through enemies, which is great for cutting through limbs. You also have a slow down time thingy, which can be useful for getting out of a jam with a lot of the monsters, or can help with some of the puzzles. You also have a telekinesis thingy beam, yeah, I know, original names, that's used for some of the game's puzzles, but I didn't really find a use aside from that. Each weapon has a secondary feature, like a different shot for the starting pistol, or a grenade launcher for the bazooka. Overall, the amount of weapons helps break the monotony of the game itself, which I'll get into shortly. Now, one thing you've probably noticed by now is that there's no real in-game hub, as in there's no health bar or a corner in the screen dedicated to a map. For the sake of the immersion, Dead Space mitigates all this by having the health bar literally on him, and whenever you need to open a map or an inventory, the game world still goes on. It's not like a pause screen, which also means that enemies can attack you when you're looking at the map, which could be a little annoying, to be perfectly honest, but for the most part, this lack of a hub gets the player more immersed in the game, staying on guard, wondering if a necromorph is around the corner while looking at the inventory. Of course, though, this is when the game works well when it's scary, and I'll get into that shortly. As far as what you do from level to level, well, it's either to go to the general hub where you do a bunch of fetch quests for the sake of escaping the ship, or kill a bunch of necromorphs that try to scare you. There are a few moments where there's anti-gravity, which is kinda cool, and it affects what the kind of puzzles you solve, or it's just a cool action set piece. Aside from that, there's a few boss battles in the middle and end of the game, and they're not really that interesting. Just shoot the yellow lumps and that's really about it. Nothing special. Overall, the gameplay is somewhat interesting if you're into third-person shooters, since you're not shooting the head of your enemies, but at the same time, it feels like an average third-person shooter with light puzzle mechanics to break the monotony every once in a while. Like I said before, most of the chapters pretty much evaluate to fetch quests if anything, and it just gets old after a while. Sure, each chapter you're going into a new area, or you'll just revisit an old area, and you'll learn more about the ship and the somewhat predictable story. But that's about it. What I'm saying is the gameplay gets old after a while, and if the game had a little bit more interesting twists in its gameplay, or a little bit more variety, that would have helped. And no, having 2 space shooter segments just put in there in the game for some random reason doesn't really help with the gameplay. In fact, it kind of messes with the game's pacing, if anything. Now, as for presentation, well, graphically for 2008, this game looks stunning. But for the most part, if you want the best graphical experience, play the PC version. Yes, the PS3 version looks great, especially with the lighting engine they implemented, but at the same time, for what I've seen in the PS3 version, the game is either too damn dark or way too bright in some instances. And I had to change the lighting options multiple times in this playthrough I did for the review. Although the game looks great, unfortunately the areas that you traverse through look very, well, samey. Don't get me wrong, there are a few standout moments and memorable set pieces, but I can't ignore the fact that a lot of the areas in the game look very similar, and revisiting areas in the game doesn't really help to begin with. Also, side note, I did run into a few glitches like this one. Very odd to say the least, but I won't fault the game for that. Now, as for sound design, well, this game is great for the most part. The music I don't really find to be too memorable, but it gets the job done, so I can't complain. But the sound the ship makes itself, and the sounds of the monsters crawling through the vents, and just their noises, and all the growls and roars and everything, it just sounds great. It helps me get immersed in the game, and, well, it just helps with the game making it a lot more scary. Which, now you random viewer from God knows where is probably asking this question, is this game any scary? Well, my answer is pretty simple. Sometimes. The game does fault by using a lot of jump scares, especially in the beginning of the game, but at the same time, the game's lighting engine and the designs of the necromorphs work. Sometimes. I already addressed the issue I had with the lighting engine, but with how the game stages the jump scares with the necromorphs, it just seems predictable, to say the least. Like, sometimes you enter a room with a bunch of dead bodies and a necromorph just so happens to be laying on the ground, and it may just pop up and attack you the first few times, but after a while, you can tell it's coming, and they keep reusing this trope over and over and over again. Another example of overused tropes is when the game locks you into a room with a bunch of necromorphs when the lights are flashing. They overuse this in the game a lot, and it gets old after a while. And then the most obvious problem it has when it comes to the game to actually scaring me, it's the monster's AI. Let me explain this one. For the most part, necromorphs either come out of air vents where you can shoot, or they're just walking around the ship. Now say if you walk in and out of a room with a bunch of monsters, or walk up and down the stairs when the monsters can see you, they'll just ignore you. This is just odd, to say the least, and can be easily exploited, say if you need to heal or something while a bunch of monsters are trying to attack you. Here's something similar happened to me with the game's first mini-boss. So overall, the game can be scary, especially with a great sound design, but these problems kind of hinder this horror game from being, well, horror. Overall, my thoughts on Dead Space are, well, just kinda average. It's certainly aged well considering the game is almost a decade old, but at the same time, with the repetitive nature of the game, a somewhat predictable story, and the main character being as interesting as a piece of wood, you have a game that just seems a little overpraised when it first came out. But at the same time, I understand why this game got praised. It was made at a time when survival horror wasn't really the norm. Around this time, aside from Resident Evil, there weren't really that many big AAA horror games. So to have a horror game being published by one of the biggest game publishers around definitely helps, and I will commend Dead Space for putting survival horror back into the limelight. If you like the game, then that's understandable. But for me, I really feel like I need to have more of an interesting story or world just to get me more invested in the game to begin with. And maybe some better AI. Well, anyway, thank you guys for watching. If you like what you see here, please leave a like. If this is your first time seeing this ugly ass face on YouTube, then please leave me a sub. I am trying to get this YouTube channel back in order with more game reviews and such. If you guys want to suggest a game I should review in the future, please put it in the comment section below. I may review that in the future. And that's about it. Thank you guys for watching, and stay beautiful.